He called me old school in front of the entire production team. Brandon Vance smirked like he had just reinvented the wheel, then tried to explain my own quality control protocols back to me using a PowerPoint presentation he had downloaded from some consulting website. I did not even correct him. I just sat there drinking the same burnt coffee from the break room that I had been drinking for 16 years, and I listened to Brandon, fresh out of whatever Master of Business Administration program his daddy's money had bought him, call my safety checkpoints legacy friction. That was my first real clue that this was not about efficiency, it was about erasure. My name is Julian Barlow, and at 54 years old, I have been keeping the production lines running at Summit Manufacturing here in Denver since Brandon was probably still figuring out how to tie his shoes. People think quiet means weak. They think experience means you are too set in your ways to adapt. That is why executives love hiring fresh graduates until they finally remind them that theory and reality are two very different animals. Brandon did not know the difference between compliance standards and a sandwich order. He thought federal regulations were mere suggestions. And yet somehow, this walking case study in nepotism landed the title of Director of Operational Excellence. No interviews, no shop floor experience, just a recycled consultant voice and a last name that made human resources nod like bobblehead dolls. Before Brandon showed up, my days were predictable in the best possible way. I had built that predictability over 16 years, starting in 2007 as an independent consultant, when Summit Manufacturing was still recovering from their merger with Crestview Industries. They needed someone to integrate two completely different manufacturing database systems, and I was the guy who knew both platforms inside and out. Back then, Lawrence Vance, Brandon's father, was just the vice president of operations, hungry to prove himself to the board of directors. He would walk the shop floor every morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, sharp, coffee in hand, checking on overnight production numbers. We developed a good working relationship. He respected my technical knowledge, and I respected his business sense. When they offered me a full-time position in 2008, it felt like joining a family business where competence still mattered. I had trained every systems engineer they had hired over the years, helped 3 different plant managers navigate their first federal audits without a single violation. And I even taught Lawrence's nephew, Justin Vance, so that he could understand database integration and become decent before transferring to Phoenix. Quality control systems were humming, production targets were consistently met, and we achieved 0 regulatory violations for 8 straight years. The federal inspector who came through in 2019 complimented our documentation trail, saying it was some of the cleanest record-keeping she had seen. That was not luck. That was 16 years of building systems that did not just work, they worked reliably. But Brandon wanted to make his mark fast. He had been here exactly 11 days when he called his first efficiency review meeting. He walked into conference room B with a stack of printed charts and a presentation of 47 slides. I counted them. "What we are looking at here," he said, clicking through global consulting reports, "is operational bloat disguised as quality assurance. We are spending too much time on redundant checkpoints that slow down our throughput." He used the phrase measurable value 12 times in 30 minutes, as if he had just discovered it. The first system he targeted was my dual signature protocol for vendor modifications. Anytime we changed suppliers or modified existing vendor specifications, 2 different people had to sign off, one from procurement and one from quality assurance. It had been in place since 2009 after we got burned by a supplier who switched to cheaper materials without telling us and cost us $67,000 in rejected product. This creates unnecessary friction in our vendor relationships. Brandon explained to the room of 8 people, most of whom had been here longer than he had been out of college. We need to streamline decision-making and eliminate bottlenecks that prevent us from being agile. I raised my hand. "Brandon, that protocol has caught 3 major supplier issues in the past 18 months. Without it, we would have had compliance problems and potentially contaminated product reaching customers." He smiled that condescending smile. "Julian, I appreciate your concern for quality, but we need to balance quality with efficiency. The data shows that 97% of vendor modifications go through without issues. We are designing our entire process around the 3% exception cases. Those 3% exception cases that we catch represent about $150,000 in potential losses per incident, I replied. Plus regulatory violations that could shut us down for weeks. That is exactly the kind of fear-based thinking that keeps organizations stuck in the past, he said, clicking to his next slide. We need to embrace calculated risks and trust our partners. This from someone who had never met a vendor, never walked a production line during a quality crisis, and never had to explain to regulators why a contaminated product made it past our safeguards. But I did not argue. I just nodded and took notes, because arguing with someone like Brandon in a public meeting is like wrestling with a pig. You both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. The meeting ended with Brandon's efficiency initiative, and it was approved by Lawrence Vance himself. There were 5 signatures on the form, including mine, because sometimes you have to pick your battles carefully. That afternoon, I started a spreadsheet tracking every change Brandon implemented with columns for predicted impact and actual results. I had a feeling I was going to need it. Brandon's second week started with what he called a comprehensive process audit. He had scheduled individual meetings with every department head, armed with a tablet full of efficiency metrics and corporate buzzwords. I was his 3 in the afternoon appointment on Tuesday. He had moved into the corner office that used to belong to Miriam Geller, our old quality director, before she retired last month. The walls were already covered with his printed charts and a whiteboard full of process flow diagrams. "Julian, thanks for coming," he said, not looking up from his tablet. "I have been reviewing your system's architecture, and I have some thoughts on optimization opportunities." I sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited. In 16 years, I had learned that when someone says they have thoughts on optimization, what they really mean is they are about to break something that works. "Your vendor platform," he continued, "is generating approval delays. Average processing time is 3.2 days. Industry standard is 1.8 days. I leaned back. Those 3.2 days include verification and compliance review. Last year, that extra time caught 2 vendors with falsified insurance and 1 with environmental violations. Without vetting, we inherit their liability." Brandon waved his hand. "But we lose bids because our process is too slow. If we streamline, we save $23,000 annually." I leaned forward. "Brandon, 1 violation starts at $45,000. 1 insurance claim from an unverified vendor could cost $200,000. That extra day and a half has saved more money than you will save in a decade." "That is risk-averse thinking," he said. "We cannot build our entire operation around worst-case scenarios." I shook my head. "We build our operation around realistic scenarios like the vendor who submitted fake clearance documents last March. Without that check, we would have had federal regulators breathing down our necks." He shrugged. "1 isolated incident. Actually, it was 3 last year. But they are not incidents when you catch them early. Julian, experience without adaptation is stagnation. We must evolve to remain competitive." He then showed me his solution, a streamlined vendor approval system that eliminated redundant verification steps. In his eyes, this new system did not require dual signatures, and it completely bypassed compliance double-checking, requiring only a basic review and approval within 24 hours. "This will position us as vendor-friendly," he said. I scheduled a follow-up, then opened my tracking spreadsheet. Vendor approval streamlining, increased compliance risk. The following Monday, Brandon announced his vendor streamlining initiative in an email to all department heads. The system went live on Wednesday. By Friday, we had approved 3 new vendors in record time. Brandon sent another email to celebrate the paradigm shift. The following Tuesday, I got a call from our insurance broker. One of those fast-approved vendors had let their liability coverage lapse 2 months ago. They had submitted outdated documents, and without our standard verification process, no one had called to confirm current coverage. The vendor was currently operating $50,000 worth of equipment on our production floor with 0 insurance. I forwarded the broker's email to Brandon with a simple message, asking him to check the potential liability exposure from vendor number 2. His response came back 3 hours later. Thanks for flagging. Let's discuss solutions rather than dwelling on problems. Solutions. As if the solution was not the verification process he had just eliminated. But it got worse. The second fast-approved vendor had submitted environmental clearance documents that looked legitimate until our environmental compliance officer decided to make a routine verification call. It turned out the clearance number was real, but it belonged to a different company with a similar name. Our new vendor had essentially committed federal document fraud to speed up their approval. I sent Brandon another email to warn him that the environmental documentation for vendor number 2 appeared to be falsified, and I recommended an immediate suspension pending our investigation. His response: let's not jump to conclusions. Schedule a meeting to clarify discrepancies. Clarify discrepancies, like you clarify whether someone robbed a bank by asking them politely if they happen to borrow some money. I printed both emails and added them to a folder on my desk. Then I sent a formal risk assessment memo to Lawrence Vance, copying the legal department and our corporate insurance liaison. The memo was 2 pages long, outlining the potential liability exposure from streamlined vendor approval processes and recommending immediate review. I did not mention Brandon by name, but the timeline made it obvious whose initiative had created the problems. Lawrence's response came the next morning. It was a phone call. "Julian, I got your memo. These vendor issues, are they related to Brandon's efficiency improvements?" "The timeline suggests a correlation," I said. "The problems emerged after we modified our verification protocols." "Have you discussed this with Brandon directly?" "I flagged both issues via email. He has indicated a preference for vendor meetings over suspension." There was silence. Then Lawrence said, "Let me look into this. In the meantime, do not send any more memos without talking to me first." That afternoon, Brandon stopped by my desk. "Julian, I understand you have concerns. We are trying to modernize our operations. Change can be uncomfortable, but it is necessary." I looked up. "Brandon, we have 2 vendors with serious compliance issues that our old process would have caught. And we also have faster vendor onboarding that is improving our competitive positioning. We cannot let isolated incidents paralyze our progress. These are not isolated incidents. They are predictable outcomes of insufficient verification. That is where we disagree," he said with a smile. "I think these are growing pains as we transition. What I need from you is support for the transition, not constant pushback." I nodded slowly. Understood. But what I understood was not what he thought. The following week, things escalated beyond vendor approval issues. Brandon had moved on to what he called production efficiency optimization. In plain terms, he wanted to eliminate what he saw as unnecessary quality checkpoints in our manufacturing process. Our production line was structured with 7 quality control stations. These included a raw material inspection, a pre-assembly verification, and a mid-process quality check. We also had a final assembly inspection, a packaging verification, a shipping documentation review, and a batch record completion. Each station had been added for a specific reason, usually after we had learned an expensive lesson about what happens when you skip important steps. Brandon's efficiency analysis showed that eliminating 3 of those checkpoints would increase throughput by 12% and reduce labor costs by approximately $180,000 annually. His presentation to the management team was 23 slides of charts and graphs, proving that our quality processes were statistically excessive. I was not in that meeting. I only found out about it when Clara Jenkins from the Human Resources Department forwarded the implementation timeline to me. We had 2 weeks to transition to streamline quality protocols and train staff. The 3 checkpoints Brandon wanted eliminated were the mid-process quality check, packaging verification, and shipping documentation review. On paper, they looked redundant. In reality, they were the difference between shipping good product and shipping expensive mistakes. The mid-process quality check had caught a temperature control malfunction last year that would have ruined $45,000 worth of product. The packaging verification had identified mislabeled products 6 times in the past 18 months, preventing customer complaints. The shipping documentation review had caught invoicing errors that would have cost us $23,000 in undercharges. I requested a meeting with Brandon to discuss the implementation plan. He fit me into his schedule on Thursday afternoon. "Julian, I am glad you are taking initiative on this transition," he said as I sat down. "Your buy-in is important for team morale." "Brandon, I am concerned about eliminating the mid-process quality check. That station has prevented significant product loss multiple times. I have reviewed the data. The mid-process check catches issues in approximately 2.3% of production runs. We are building the entire process around statistical outliers. But those 2.3% that we catch represent about $200,000 in potential losses annually. The cost of the quality check is about $35,000 per year in labor. We are getting a 6-to-1 return on investment." He pulled up a spreadsheet. "But if we eliminate the check and accept the occasional loss, we still come out ahead due to increased throughput." The math is simple. The math changes when regulators get involved. If we ship defective product that reaches customers, we are looking at recalls, investigations, and potential facility shutdowns. Those costs are not in your spreadsheet, Brandon. This is exactly the risk-averse thinking that prevents organizations from optimizing. We cannot design our entire system around worst-case scenarios. They are not worst-case scenarios. They are scenarios that have already happened. That is why these checkpoints exist based on historical data. That data may not reflect our current capabilities," he said, closing his laptop. "We need to trust our improved processes." I left that meeting and did something I had been avoiding for weeks. I called our food and drug compliance liaison, Clara Santos, someone I had worked with through 4 different compliance audits. "Clara, hypothetical question. If a manufacturing facility eliminated mid-process quality checkpoints and shipping verification, how would that affect their compliance status?" "It depends on what they make," she said. "For food-grade products, those checkpoints are required to maintain an audit trail. If we eliminate them, we will trigger compliance reviews. If a defective product reaches customers, that is recall territory. Depending on severity, it could mean inspections, shutdowns, or penalties." "Why are you asking?" "Just staying informed," I replied. "Julian, in 8 years you have never asked hypothetical questions. Is there something you need to know?" I paused. "There are proposed changes that concern me. If you want to run specific procedures by me, I will provide guidance. Better to catch issues before implementation." That conversation gave me what I needed. I sent Brandon an email outlining compliance concerns, offering to arrange a consultation with our regulatory liaison. His response came in 15 minutes. "Thanks for your input. We will proceed as planned. Please focus on training staff rather than identifying obstacles." I printed that email and added it to my folder. The next morning, Lawrence Vance called me in. "Mr. Vance would like to see you immediately," his assistant said. I walked into that corner office knowing something had shifted. Lawrence sat behind his desk with a printout of my email exchange with Brandon. His expression was not friendly. "Julian, Brandon tells me you are resisting efficiency initiatives and undermining his authority." I sat down. "I have raised legitimate compliance concerns through the proper channels." "Did you do this by contacting regulators behind his back?" "I consulted with our liaison about regulatory requirements. That is standard due diligence. You did it without informing Brandon." "I informed Brandon about potential compliance issues via email. He preferred proceeding without consultation." Lawrence leaned back. "Julian, you have been here 16 years, but Brandon is implementing changes to keep us competitive. I need to know you will support him, not look for reasons why it will not work. I support initiatives that do not create regulatory risks." "That is not what I asked." His voice had taken on an executive tone. "I asked if you were going to support Brandon's leadership, yes or no." I looked at him. This man who used to walk the production floor and listen to me. "I support procedures that protect the company from violations. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I can give." He nodded slowly. "Then we have a problem." The all-hands meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning in the main conference room. It was the big room with the projector and the long table that seated 25 people. When I walked in, every chair was filled except one at the far end, which was my usual spot. Lawrence Vance stood at the head of the table with Brandon beside him. Both of them wore the kind of serious expressions that meant someone was about to be publicly reprimanded. The agenda had only one item: operational alignment and team expectations. "Thank you all for being here," Lawrence began, his voice carrying that familiar executive authority. "We are gathered to address some concerns about our recent process improvements and to clarify expectations for supporting leadership initiatives." He gestured toward Brandon. "My son has been implementing critical efficiency improvements that will position us for continued growth and competitiveness. These changes represent the future of our operations." I could feel eyes turning toward me. Word travels fast in a manufacturing facility, and everyone knew about my escalations over vendor approvals and quality checkpoints. "However," Lawrence continued, "change can be challenging. Some team members may struggle to adapt to new methodologies, particularly those who have become comfortable with legacy processes." Legacy processes. There it was. After 16 years of building systems that worked, I was now officially the guy clinging to outdated methods. "Effective leadership requires team alignment," Lawrence said, his gaze settling directly on me. "When team members consistently question decisions, create resistance to change, or go around established authority to raise concerns with external parties, it undermines our operational effectiveness." The room was dead silent. You could hear the ventilation system cycling on. "Julian," Lawrence said, and every head in the room turned to look at me. "You have been with us for 16 years. Your technical knowledge is valuable, but your recent actions suggest a fundamental disagreement with our leadership direction." I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded in front of me on the table. "Brandon has shown remarkable initiative in identifying improvement opportunities. His background and fresh perspective are exactly what we need to modernize our operations. What we do not need is resistance disguised as concern." Brandon sat perfectly still, but I could see the slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "So, I am going to be very clear about expectations going forward," Lawrence continued. "We need people who are willing to embrace change rather than those who are constantly identifying reasons why these improvements will not work." He paused, letting that sink in. "Julian, I need you to publicly acknowledge Brandon's leadership and commit to supporting his initiatives without reservation. I need you to apologize for going around his authority and creating friction during this transition period." 24 pairs of eyes stared at me. The silence stretched out like a wire about to snap. "Furthermore," Lawrence added, "you are off operational projects until you are willing to demonstrate that commitment publicly." I looked around the room at faces I had worked with for years. Miriam Geller, whom I had helped train on quality systems. Peter Geller from procurement, who had relied on my vendor verification process dozens of times. Linda Williams from the production department, who was the one who knew exactly why those quality checkpoints were so important to us. None of them met my eyes. They all looked down at their notebooks or stared at the wall. They had mortgages, families, and jobs to protect. I could not blame them, but I also could not join them in their silence. I unmuted myself from the mental static, stood up slowly, and pushed my chair back from the table. I looked directly at Lawrence. "I understand completely," I said. "Do you?" Lawrence pressed, "because understanding and agreeing are different things. I need to know you are going to support Brandon's leadership going forward." I looked at him, then at Brandon, and then back to Lawrence. "I understand that my 16 years of ensuring quality and compliance are now viewed as legacy friction. I understand that you value nepotism over operational safety, and I understand that my presence here is no longer required under these conditions." Then I turned and walked out of that conference room. I walked down the hallway, past the production floor I had helped optimize for 16 years, past the break room where I had drunk thousands of cups of terrible coffee, and straight to my desk. I did not log out of my computer. I did not pack my office. I just opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a single manila folder I had kept there since 2007. Inside was a copy of my original consulting contract, the one from before I became a full-time employee, back when Summit Manufacturing was a struggling regional operation. I turned to Section 12, subsection D, which was highlighted in faded yellow ink. Vanguard Systems, as the independent consulting entity, retains sole and exclusive ownership rights to all proprietary system modifications, database architectures, and integration protocols developed independently during the contract period. In the event of contract transition or employment termination, the client maintains a non-exclusive license, which is subject to immediate suspension upon termination of services if outstanding administrative or licensing conditions are not satisfied. The contract defined outstanding conditions to include any modifications of system access control parameters without consent of the developer. I smiled. Lawrence and his legal team had signed that contract in 2007 without a second thought, and they had never bothered to update it when they transitioned me to full-time status. I put the folder in my briefcase, took my car keys, and walked out the door. I spent the weekend at home, sitting at my kitchen table with a pot of fresh coffee that actually tasted good for once. I opened my personal laptop and systematically documented every database system, API integration, and compliance reporting module I had built or modified over the last 16 years. The vendor integration platform, the quality control database, the shipping verification portal, and the automated FDA compliance reporting engine. All of them were built on top of proprietary software cores registered to Vanguard systems. They were not company property. They were licensed intellectual property. On Monday morning, I did not go to the office. Instead, I logged into the Vanguard Systems Administrative Server, which hosted the license validation files for all of Summit Manufacturing's integrated platforms. I changed exactly one database parameter in each system, modifying the licensing status from active to pending renewal. The first system to experience a disruption was the production monitoring dashboard. It was not a crash, but a system-wide lock. The screens on the shop floor stopped displaying real-time data, showing a simple message instead. License verification failed. Contact Vanguard Systems for renewal authorization. By Tuesday afternoon, half of their operational systems were running in degraded mode. Quality control reports were backing up because the automated reporting engine refused to generate compliance files. New vendor onboarding was completely blocked, and the shipping verification portal was refusing to clear outgoing shipments. The investor dashboard that Brandon used for his weekly presentations was displaying nothing but database connection errors. The plant was descending into operational chaos, and nobody at Summit Manufacturing knew how to fix it because I was the only one who understood the underlying code. My phone rang on Wednesday morning. It was Lawrence Vance. His voice had lost all that executive confidence. He sounded panicked. "Julian, we have a massive system failure here. The production line is almost at a standstill because the compliance reports are not generating. Our IT department says the systems are locked by Vanguard Systems. They say it is some kind of license verification issue." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "That is correct, Lawrence. Vanguard Systems is my consulting firm. Under Section 12 of our 2007 agreement, the licenses for those proprietary systems are tied to my active service. Since you removed me from operational projects and effectively suspended my services, the licenses transitioned to pending renewal." He gasped. "You locked us out?" "No. I simply let the contract enforce itself. You wanted to eliminate legacy friction, and those systems are part of that legacy." "Surely we can resolve this," Lawrence said, his tone turning pleading. "You have been with us for 16 years. We are a family. I was family until you demanded I apologize to your son for doing my job. Now I am just an independent contractor whose license agreements have expired." "What is it going to take to get the systems back online?" he asked. I had the new consulting agreement already drafted on my laptop. "It is very simple, Lawrence. Vanguard Systems will grant a new limited license for the operational platforms under a new consulting agreement. The emergency recovery rate to restore the database linkages is $350 per hour. The ongoing monthly maintenance and compliance oversight retainer is $6,500, with a 6-month minimum commitment. And finally, all future modifications to quality control systems or vendor verification protocols must be approved by Vanguard Systems in writing after a formal technical review." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, calculating the cost of the shutdown versus the cost of my retainer. The shutdown was costing them tens of thousands of dollars every hour in delayed shipments and idle labor, not to mention the risk of regulatory penalties if they shipped without compliance reports. He had no choice. "I will have our legal counsel review the agreement and send it over," he said quietly. I received the signed contract in my email less than 2 hours later, and it had both Lawrence's signature and the corporate legal stamp. I logged back into the administrative server and restored the licensing parameters. Within minutes, the database linkages re-established, the shop floor monitors came back to life, and the compliance reports began generating once more. The system hummed back to life as if nothing had happened. I never went back to my old cubicle. Now, when I visit Summit Manufacturing, I enter through the front lobby as a visiting consultant, signing the visitor log rather than punching a time card. I have my own consulting office, and my rates are more than double my old salary. Brandon still has his title of Director of Operational Excellence, but he is a director without teeth. Every efficiency initiative he proposes must be submitted to Vanguard Systems for a technical and compliance review. If his ideas compromise quality or violate regulations, I reject them in writing, and Lawrence signs off on my decisions. Brandon has to sit in meetings and watch his father agree with every word I say. Some people call it revenge. I call it protecting your intellectual property, knowing your worth, and making sure the corporation pays every single penny of it.